What's going on, guys? My name is Matt, and today we're doing ITX on a budget. The price point for this PC build is $350, and for that price I was able to get some really great performance for the money. Just as a little teaser, this PC has a 4-core, 8-thread CPU, and an RX 480, which is some really great specs for this price. Now, just as a disclaimer, this PC is using used parts. If you're willing to go used, you can get some really great performance for the money, and even though a lot of these parts are used, many of them can be found right now for the prices I paid, and I'll leave links to those in the description down below. Another disclaimer I want to point out is this PC doesn't include the price of an operating system, but Windows 10 can be used free unactivated indefinitely, and I'll talk more about that later in the video. So I've decided to do something a little bit different with this video. I'm going to start out with the benchmarks to show you how much performance this system can put out before I reveal all of the specs. So let's get into the benchmarks, starting with PUBG. So PUBG at 1080p medium settings had an average of 78 FPS with 1% lows of 69. Now, if you know PUBG, you know that it is very hard to run and brings even a lot of very high-end systems to their knees. So being able to average above 60 FPS with a $350 PC is quite impressive. Moving on to Overwatch, a game I used to play a lot, I set everything to medium settings at 1080p with 100% resolution scaling, which is considerably harder to run than just the 1080p preset, and at these settings the system was able to get a 162 FPS average with 1% lows of 124 FPS. The gameplay was very smooth and enjoyable, and overall it was a great experience. Moving on to Shadow of the Tomb Raider, the latest and hardest to run game in my benchmark suite. I used the medium preset at 1080p with the built-in benchmark, and the system averaged 65 FPS, which is pretty impressive that it can average above 60 FPS on one of the latest and hardest to run AAA titles. Finally, the last game I tested was Fortnite, and at 1080p medium settings, the system had a 95 FPS average, which was honestly kind of disappointing. I was hoping the average for Fortnite was going to be much higher than this. With that being said, 95 FPS was still a very smooth and enjoyable experience, and overall I'm very happy with this system's performance for only $350. So now that you've seen this system's performance, I'm going to reveal all of the parts used. Starting off with the CPU, this is using a processor you may not have heard of. This is the Xeon E3 1230, which is a 4-core, 8-thread CPU that goes up to 3.6 GHz and slots inside of consumer-grade motherboards. This is essentially an i7 2600 without the integrated graphics, and the best part is this consistently goes for $55 on eBay, which is an amazing value for the money. With 8 threads, a decent IPC, and decent clock speed, the CPU can pretty much handle any game you throw at it, and can even pair well with up to a GTX 1070. Moving on to the motherboard that the CPU slots into, it is the P8H61 Asus ITX motherboard. Now generally ITX motherboards are really expensive, especially older ones because they're very hard to find, but surprisingly H61 ITX boards are pretty easy to find at around $50. This one I paid $45 for, and it actually came with a stock Intel cooler. Now this motherboard has USB 3, the 16x PCIe slot we need for our graphics card, and is overall just a really great board for the money. Like I said before, this motherboard actually came with an Intel stock cooler. This is a copper core cooler, and I just decided to use this so I didn't have to bump the budget up anymore. Because this is a locked CPU and not overclockable, this copper core stock cooler did a fine job of keeping the CPU relatively cool. And overall, even though it doesn't look great, it does get the job done. For RAM, I went with a very basic 2x4GB kit of DDR3 1333 MHz that I picked up a while ago on Craigslist for $25. This is a pretty average deal, it's not spectacular, and for Intel based platforms you don't really need any crazy fast RAM, especially if you're not overclocking, and 8GB of RAM is plenty for gaming as long as you're not running a crazy amount of stuff in the background. Now the only downside of this is it does use up both of the existing RAM slots, which means if you want to upgrade you have to take at least one step stick out, and more than likely you're going to take both sticks out to upgrade to 16 gigabytes. With that being said, again, 8 gigabytes should be plenty for most people. Moving on to the GPU, one of the stars of this PC build is the RX 480 HP OEM version that's actually an ITX card. I got this for only $100 on eBay. Now, if you're looking for a graphics card around $100, I would highly recommend going for an RX 480 or RX 470 from eBay, as RX 470s are actually going for under $100 by it now, and you're able to get RX 480s for around $100 if you watch listings. The RX 480 performs amazing at 1080p and pairs very well with this E3 1230 Xeon. It can play pretty much any game you throw at it at 60 FPS, for example Shadow of the Tomb Raider again. At medium settings, 1080p, this was above a 60 FPS average. This card in particular is pretty unique because you couldn't actually buy this card new. This card only came bundled in HP computers and is actually the only ITX RX 480 ever made. Now, I'm not talking about this card specifically, but this model of card was the only ITX 480, which is pretty interesting. Moving on to storage, I went with the 250 gigabyte Samsung drive for $40 that I got a while ago on Craigslist. SSDs are really cheap right now. You can get a new 240 gig SSD for like $35. So if you're willing to go with a smaller SSD right now and save up and add mechanical storage later down the line, I would highly recommend it, as an SSD is going to make your system seem a lot snappier, boot times are going to be a lot shorter, and game loading times are also going to be expedited. Now, obviously, if you don't think you're going to have money to upgrade in the near future, you can go with a 1TB mechanical hard drive for $40, which wouldn't be a bad idea either. For the power supply, I went with an EVGA 600 watt 80 plus certified unit that I got for only $15 off EVGA B stock. If you don't know, every Wednesday EVGA runs a sale for refurbished items, and sometimes you can get stuff really cheap. A few weeks ago, this guy was on sale for $15 and I actually picked up a couple of these. 600 watts is plenty of power for most any build, especially this one. The only downside of this is it is non-modular, and using this in an ITX compact build is not the best idea. With that being said, for $15 you can't really beat the price to performance of this 600 watt PSU. Moving on to the case, what I went with is the Ragen Tech Metis Plus. Now if you're looking into this case, make sure you get the Plus version, as the non-Plus version has very bad airflow. I got this in the white colorway, and this is constructed in aluminum and steel, so it's pretty lightweight, and at $60 it's relatively affordable. Would it have been better if I didn't spend this much money on a case in a sub $400 build? Of course, but I really wanted to build in this case and see what it was all about. Building in this case was a little bit difficult, and the biggest reason for that is because I went with a full-size ATX PSU, which it technically does support, but doesn't mean you should be using a full-size PSU, especially a non-modular one. With that being said, all the components did fit barely. I did wish I went for a beefier CPU cooler, as there's so much room in the Metis to put a really large tower cooler, but even though things were pretty tight in the case, thermals were still pretty good and nothing thermal throttled. While I'm not the biggest fan of the small side panel window on the side of this case, overall, I think this case looks really nice, and I think it's a really good value for the money in terms of an ITX chassis. Overall, this build performs really good for the $350 price point, and I'm super happy I was able to build an ITX system that performs really well on this tight of a budget. If you guys are wanting to see me build more ITX PCs in the future, let me know in the comment section down below. So yeah guys, I think this wraps this video up. I hope you guys enjoyed it. If you did, give it a thumbs up as well as consider subscribing. And this is Matt from Tech by Matt, signing out.